There's a place in every community that is supposed to represent safety above all other places. Not a church, not a hospital, not a courthouse, a police station. It is where people go when everything else has failed. When the threat is at the door, when someone is missing, when the situation is beyond what any individual can handle alone. In the public imagination, and in the literal architecture of most cities, the police station is a fortress, the place behind whose walls even the most dangerous situations are brought to order. What happens, then, when the fortress itself becomes a target? What happens when someone who has decided the rules no longer apply to them, or that they never did, walks through those doors not to seek help, but to take something, or destroy something, or make a statement that the entire world will have no choice but to hear? Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. The thing that makes a police station feel safe is the same thing that makes it a uniquely powerful target. It is a symbol. Attack the symbol, and you attack what it stands for. You send a message not just to people inside, but to everyone who believed that there were places that couldn't be reached. Today, we are going to examine 4 real incidents where police stations became the arena for something that no one inside expected. 4 cases, spanning more than 7 decades in 4 countries. A remote jungle outpost surrounded before dawn by 200 guerrillas and its small garrison of officers who refused to surrender even when surrender was the only rational option. A quiet Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C., when a murder suspect walked through the front door of police headquarters with a machine pistol and went looking for the people who were building the case against him. A pre-dawn motorcycle attack in a small Malaysian city by a young man radicalized inside his own home by a father who had spent years preparing his children for violence as a spiritual act. And finally, a pattern of increasingly sophisticated assaults on the very idea of law enforcement authority, what they reveal about who attacks these buildings, why, and what the people inside do when the unthinkable arrives. These are not hypothetical scenarios. These are documented historical events. And understanding them is not morbid fascination. It is an honest examination of what happens at the extreme edge of the breakdown between order and chaos. Because that edge exists, and people cross it. Welcome to Mind Behind the Crime. Story 1. The Malayan Alamo, Bukit Kepong, Johor, Malaya, February 23, 1950. It is 4 in the morning in the jungle. The river moves quietly beside a wooden building on stilts. There are no roads here. The nearest town is nearly 60 kilometers away, accessible only by water. The settlement of Bukit Kepong, a name that translates roughly as surrounded hill, sits isolated and dark in the pre-dawn silence of the Malayan jungle in a way that feels almost deliberate, as though the geography itself is part of what is about to happen. Inside the police station, the officers and their families are asleep. There are approximately 20 regular policemen on duty at the Bukit Kepong outpost, plus a handful of auxiliary constables drawn from the surrounding villages. Some of their wives and children are in the residential quarters attached to the station. It is, by any measure, a small force in a remote place. They know the jungle around them is not empty. The Malayan Emergency has been officially underway for nearly 2 years, a guerrilla conflict between the Federation of Malaya Police and the armed wing of the Malayan Communist Party. They have been briefed about the general security situation. What they have not been briefed about is what is encircling them right now in the darkness while they sleep. 200 against 20. The force that has positioned itself around the Bukit Kepong station by 4 in the morning on February 23rd, 1950 is not a raiding party. It is an army. An estimated 180 to 200 guerrillas of the Malayan National Liberation Army, the military arm of the Malayan Communist Party, armed with automatic weapons. Sten guns, rifles, grenades, have moved through the jungle in silence and taken up positions on all sides of the station. One of the attackers, a guerrilla member later captured and tried, gave a statement that has survived in historical records. He said, "We chose this station because it was isolated. It had no radio contact with other stations. We wanted to strengthen our prestige in that area. There were 200 men in our gang. We knew that only 20 Malays manned the police station. They chose the time for the same calculation. They believed, at 4 in the morning, that the sentries would be asleep. They were wrong about that. And that mistake, which in any rational accounting of the odds should not have been enough to matter, would define the entire engagement. At precisely 4:30, a bugle sounded. The attack began from all sides simultaneously. Automatic weapons fire poured into the wooden station from every direction. The station was surrounded so completely that there was no direction from which to run, no angle from which help could approach without being cut down in the clearing. Inside, the police officers woke up to what one can only describe as the end of the world arriving through the walls. Sergeant Jemil and the decision not to surrender. The officer in command at Bukit Kepong that morning was Sergeant Jemil bin Mohd Shah. He was a Malay policeman. He was outnumbered approximately 10-1. He was in a wooden building that was, by the standards of any military fortification, essentially indefensible. He had no radio. He had no way to call for reinforcements. He did not know how long it would take for anyone outside to even learn that the station was under attack. He gave the order to return fire. The guerrilla statement from later testimony expresses a kind of stunned recognition about this moment. He said, "We immediately received a heavy barrage of return fire. The policemen had divided into two sections. I was in the party attacking the front of the station, and I could see the policemen taking defensive positions. 200 armed guerrillas had expected to overwhelm 20 sleeping officers. What they found instead was a garrison that had come awake and was fighting back. At some point during the early hours of the assault, the communist forces called out to the officers to surrender. They were refused. The same thing happened again. Refused again. The guerrillas had brought more than guns. They brought fire. The fire, the families, and the 4-hour stand. At some point deep into the engagement, with the station still holding against the assault, the attackers threw grenades and set fire to the rear of the building. The wooden structure began to burn. Officers who had been using the walls as cover were forced to make a terrible choice: stay inside the burning building, or emerge into the open ground where 200 armed fighters were waiting. Some stayed. Some tried to run. Those who ran were met with fire before they could reach cover. Officers' wives tried to shield their children. In the chaos and smoke and gunfire of a small building on fire with a jungle army waiting outside, the situation had become one of those historical moments that language struggles to adequately describe. The stand lasted nearly 4 hours. Reinforcements had been trying to reach the station from the moment the first shots were heard in the surrounding villages. A village chief named Ali Mustafa gathered 13 auxiliary police and home guard members and led them toward Bukit Kepong as soon as the gunfire woke them. They were ambushed half a kilometer from the station by communist forces armed with automatic weapons. The villagers had shotguns. They could not advance. Another group of 4 auxiliary officers from a nearby settlement also moved toward the sound of the guns. They too were ambushed on the way. The guerrillas had planned for the reinforcement routes. They had thought through the isolation with the same precision they had applied to the initial assault. By the time the engagement ended, around 9 in the morning, the totals were devastating. 25 defenders had been killed, 14 regular police officers, 5 auxiliary constables, 2 of the officers' wives, 2 children, and 2 civilians who had been caught in the attack. The station was burned to the ground. The communists, who had achieved their tactical objectives and broken the reinforcement attempts, withdrew, but not before having suffered significant casualties themselves at the hands of defenders who refused to make it easy. Here is the military reality of Bukit Kepong. The defenders lost. They were overwhelmed by numbers and firepower and isolation and fire. And yet the Bukit Kepong incident is not remembered in Malaysia as a defeat. It is remembered as a testament, because in refusing to surrender, in choosing to fight to the last officer against odds that made their death almost mathematically certain, the garrison at Bukit Kepong demonstrated something that transcends the outcome of any individual battle. They forced the attackers, who expected an easy seizure of a sleeping outpost, to spend 4 hours on a military objective that was supposed to take minutes. They changed what the attack cost, and they changed what it meant. What came after? The commander of the attacking force, a man known as Mat Indra, was eventually captured in 1951 during jungle operations. He was tried for murder and rebellion in 1952. The court found him guilty, and he was hanged in January 1953. The Bukit Kepong Police Station today is a memorial and interpretive center. It draws visitors from across Malaysia, students, historians, and families who want to see where 20 men and women held a 200-strong army at bay for 4 hours because their sergeant told them to return fire, and they did. The Malaysian National Police Force's annual memorial to the incident is still observed. The Inspector General of Police, speaking at the most recent commemoration, said that the legacy of Bukit Kepong must be institutionalized as a moral compass for modern policing, not merely as a historical footnote, but as a daily reminder of what duty, under the most extreme pressure, is supposed to look like. Some draw the comparison to the Alamo. It is not an inaccurate comparison. Like the Alamo, it was a defense that ended in the deaths of nearly everyone who held the line. And like the Alamo, it became something larger than its outcome, a story about what people are willing to do when they decide the ground they stand on is worth standing on. Times. Story 2. Murder in the Murder Capital. MPD Headquarters, Washington, D.C., November 22nd, 1994. Washington, D.C. in 1994 was carrying a title that no city wants. The murder capital of the United States. The crack epidemic had been burning through its neighborhoods for nearly a decade. That year, more Americans were killed in Washington, D.C. than died in 8 years of combat operations in Afghanistan. The homicide detectives working those cases were not naive about the environment they operated in. They knew what it cost to build cases against the people responsible for those numbers. They knew those people knew their names. What none of them anticipated, what, looking back, may seem obvious but at the time felt genuinely inconceivable, was that the place least likely to be targeted was a place about to be targeted. You do not walk into a police headquarters in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon and open fire. You simply don't. The logic of institutional inviolability, the unspoken understanding that some places are off limits even to people who have placed themselves outside the law, made the very idea seem absurd. Benny Lee Lawson was 25 years old. He had a prior weapons conviction. A week before this Tuesday, he had been brought in and questioned by MPD's cold case squad in connection with a triple homicide. The questioning had concluded without an arrest. But Lawson had left with something he hadn't walked in with, the knowledge that the people in that building were building a case against him. He came back. The cold case squad, 3rd floor. The cold case squad occupied offices on the 3rd floor of MPD's headquarters building on Indiana Avenue. It had been created in 1991 specifically to revisit unsolved homicide cases, the cases that had accumulated during the epidemic years, the cases where witnesses had been too afraid or too gone to speak, the cases that the system had filed and moved on from but that families had never been able to close. The squad was a joint operation, meaning that FBI special agents worked alongside MPD detectives in the same office space. It was, by every account of people who worked there, a high-functioning team doing unglamorous work in a city that desperately needed it. On the morning of November 22nd, 1994, Special Agent John Cookter arrived at his desk and began preparing for witness interviews. He had been in the Bureau for 3 years, working homicide cases alongside seasoned veterans. He later said, felt like exactly where he was supposed to be. Into the squad room came MPD Sergeant Henry Hank Daly, 51 years old, 28 years with the department, a Marine Corps veteran who had come up through the department during the worst years and had spent a decade in homicide before being tapped to lead the cold case squad. The kind of officer that junior colleagues describe in the same language. Always, he showed you the way. He didn't tell you what to do. He showed you. FBI Special Agent Michael Miller, 41 years old, was at his desk. Special Agent Martha Dixon Martinez, 35 years old, was in the adjoining room. 6 weeks married to another FBI agent, a forensic chemist turned special agent who had become the first female SWAT team member of the Knoxville Field Office and had helped found the Washington Field Office's Evidence Response Team, which would later be renamed in her honor. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, the elevator opened on the 3rd floor. Benny Lee Lawson walked out of it with a TEC-9 modified to fire automatically. He had handwritten notes at his home. Investigators who found them later said they named specific targets, the commander of the homicide squad and his investigators. He found the squad room. He said, "This is the way it is." And he fired. 50 feet, no cover, a decision. Sergeant Hank Daly was shot and killed. Agent Miller was shot and killed. John Cookter was hit and went down, seriously wounded, fighting to stay conscious, fighting to stay in the exchange. In the adjoining room, Special Agent Martha Dixon Martinez heard the gunfire erupt. She heard it clearly, an experienced agent. She identified immediately what it was, a fully automatic weapon. She understood what that meant for anyone in that room. She drew a sidearm and went toward the sound. Her brother Paul, speaking at a memorial service 20 years later, described this moment in terms that carry their own quiet weight. He said, "The assailant was in a different part of the room, shooting members of her squad. Martha heard the gunfire. She recognized it was a fully automatic weapon, but she drew her sidearm and went in anyway. She was shot and killed. Lawson died of gunshot wounds sustained during the exchange. Investigators later concluded it was a self-inflicted wound, though the precise sequence of events in those few seconds of chaos has never been completely disentangled from the multiple weapons fired in that room. A 15-year-old boy who happened to be in the area was shot in the leg. He survived. The entire incident lasted approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes. In that span of time, 3 people who had dedicated their careers to reducing the violence in a city that was drowning in it were shot and killed inside the building that represented law enforcement itself. And one of them, a woman who heard the sound of an automatic weapon and chose to run toward it rather than away from it, made a decision in less than a second that tells you everything you need to know about what it means to truly believe in the work you have chosen. What changed because of that day? The day is remembered by people who were in and around MPD headquarters that afternoon with a clarity that time has not softened. One journalist who was on the same floor at a press conference when the shots were fired described it as a smoke wafting out from behind a door that wouldn't open, and officers on the outside trying to get in, unable to get past the security gate in time. Before November 22nd, 1994, it was genuinely possible to walk through the front door of the Metropolitan Police Department's headquarters building in Washington, D.C., and take the elevator to the 3rd floor without passing through any significant security barrier. The idea that you needed to secure police headquarters against armed intruders was not something that the architecture reflected. It does now. The attack at MPD headquarters accelerated a national rethinking of security protocols at law enforcement facilities that had previously operated under the assumption that the badge and the building provided their own deterrent. The barricades and metal detectors and visitor screening that today feel like standard features of any serious government facility were, in many places, direct responses to what happened in a cold K-Squad office on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Agent Martha Dixon Martinez's name is on the Wall of Honor at FBI headquarters. The evidence response team she helped create carries her name. Sergeant Hank Daly's name is etched into the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial alongside Agent Miller's. Every year, on the 22nd of November, a wreath-laying ceremony is held at that memorial. In November 2024, on the 30th anniversary, the current FBI Assistant Director in charge said, 3 decades ago, 3 of our own lost their lives in the line of duty. Today and every day, we remember Martha, Mike, and Hank, and the sacrifices they made. John Kuchta, the agent who was seriously wounded in the attack and survived, continued his career with the Bureau. Speaking at the 20th anniversary memorial, he said that what the Cold K-Squad had been doing, what Daly and Dixon and Miller had been doing, helped transform a city that had been losing itself. He said the city is different because of the work they did, and that the only way to honor them was to continue it. Times. Story 3. The boy his father built. Ulu Tiram Police Station, Johor, Malaysia, May 17, 2024. In the early hours of May 17, 2024, 2 college students arrived at the Ulu Tiram Police Station in the southern Malaysian state of Johor. It was 2:30 in the morning. They wanted to file a report about a molestation incident that had occurred 2 years earlier. Late? Yes. An unusual hour for such a report. But not, on its face, suspicious. People come to police stations at odd hours for many reasons. The 2 students were let in. 5 minutes later, a young man on a motorcycle arrived at the station and walked toward the rear of the building. He was wearing dark clothing. He had a mask over his face. Over his shoulder was draped a black banner, the distinctive flag of the Islamic State. What happened in the next several minutes will become the most significant attack on a Malaysian law enforcement facility in decades. It would generate international headlines. It would prompt a nationwide review of police station security. It would result in the arrest of the attacker's entire immediate family. And it would force Malaysian authorities to confront a form of radicalization that they had not anticipated, not cells of foreign-trained militants, not networks of organized extremists communicating online, but something quieter, smaller, and in some ways more difficult to find and stop. A family. Constable Ahmed Azhar Fahmy, 22 years old. Constable Ahmed Azhar Fahmi Azhar was 22 years old. He had been with the Royal Malaysia Police for a short time. He was on duty at the rear of the station when the young man on the motorcycle arrived and made his way through. Ahmed Azhar Fahmi went to investigate. He was stabbed with a machete. In the struggle, the attacker seized a constable's firearm. Constable Muhammad Saifiq Ahmed said, 24 years old, and another officer rushed toward the sound of the confrontation. A shootout followed in the narrow space at the rear of the station. Constable Muhammad Saifiq was fatally shot. The other officer was seriously wounded. A third officer, returning from patrol, arrived and exchanged fire with the attacker. He wounded the attacker. The attacker fell. He was 21 years old. His name was Raiden Lukman bin Raiden Imran. The two college students who had arrived 5 minutes before the attack were detained immediately. In the first confusing hours after the incident, investigators were trying to understand whether their arrival at an unusual hour for an unusual report precisely 5 minutes before the attack had been coordinated to draw attention to the front of the station while the attacker approached from the rear. Later investigation would clear them of involvement. Their timing, it seems, was coincidental. An extraordinary and tragic coincidence. Who Raiden Lukman was, and who made him. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Malaysian police linked it to Jemaah Islamiyah, the regional militant network responsible for, among other things, the 2002 Bali bombings that killed over 200 people. The basis of this initial assessment was the attacker's father, who was a known JI member. As the investigation developed, the picture became more complicated and in some ways more disturbing than a simple JI affiliation would have been. Raiden Lukman's father, Raiden Imran bin Raiden Mod Yassin, had spent years building something inside his own home. Not a bomb, not a weapons cache, an ideology. According to investigators and terrorism analysts who reviewed the case, the father had deliberately isolated his family from Malaysian society. They lived apart, off-grid, away from school systems and social networks, and the ordinary friction of community life that tends to moderate extreme views by exposing people to alternative perspectives. The children were educated at home in a theological framework that the father controlled entirely. Over years, the family had progressively withdrawn from the world. Terrorism analysts who reviewed the case in detail identified what one described as a self-imposed ideological exile, a closed system in which the father's distorted interpretation of religious obligation became, for the children raised inside it, simply reality, not a fringe view, not something they knew to question, the air they breathed. Raiden Lukman had reportedly been living in a state that researchers describe using the Japanese term hikikomori, a severe social withdrawal in which a person becomes almost entirely confined to their immediate domestic environment. He had no criminal record. He had no known direct contact with any terrorist organization. He had not been radicalized by an online recruitment campaign or by foreign handlers. He had been radicalized by his father, in his home, over the course of his entire life. This is one of the most chilling aspects of the Ulu Tiram case for counterterrorism researchers. The radicalization pathway is one of the hardest to detect precisely because it operates inside the most private possible space. You can monitor online platforms. You can track financial flows. You can watch who travels to which countries and meets which people. You cannot easily see what a father teaches his children inside a home from which the family has chosen to withdraw entirely. The question it forces is, how do you find the threat you cannot see coming? The family charge and what it means. By 6 in the morning on May 17th, police had raided the family's home in Ulu Tiram. 5 family members were arrested. The father, the mother, a Singaporean citizen, the attacker's older brother, and 2 sisters. In June 2024, all 5 were formally charged in court with terrorism-related offenses. Among the charges against the father, encouraging terrorist acts by incorporating Islamic State ideology into his family's upbringing. That charge, encouraging terrorism through the deliberate ideological shaping of your own children, represents a legal and philosophical frontier that many countries are still working through. At what point does parenting become radicalization? At what point does a parent's religious conviction become a terrorism offense? The Malaysian prosecution's answer was clear. When it produces a son who walks into a police station with a machete and a gun and kills 2 officers who were 22 and 24 years old. Corporal Ahmed Azhar Fahmi Azhar and Corporal Muhammad Saifiq Ahmed said, both posthumously promoted in rank. were honored with state funerals. 3 other officers involved in the incident received field promotions. In the weeks following the attack, Malaysian authorities announced that all police station gates nationwide will be closed after 10 o'clock at night. New CCTV systems and floodlighting were installed at key positions within stations. The entire security architecture of Malaysian policing facilities, which had operated on an assumption of openness, was revised. The Ulu Tiram attack was the second Islamic State-inspired incident on Malaysian soil since a 2016 pub bombing. Analysts in the Malaysian government were careful to note that it was not evidence of an organized JI resurgence or directed campaign, but it was, as one review in the year-end reporting put it, a reminder that extremism can strike anywhere, not just in conflict zones, not just from organized networks, but from inside the closed world of a family that has decided the society around it is the enemy. Times. Story 4. The psychology of attacking the symbol. Why people attack police stations, and what it tells us. 3 stories. 3 incidents from 3 different countries and 3 different decades. A communist guerrilla siege in 1950 Malaya. A motor suspect walking through a metal detector-free lobby in 1994 Washington. A radicalized young man in 2024 Malaysia, shaped for violence by a father who saw the police station down the road as the front line of a holy war. The mechanics are different. The ideologies are different. The outcomes are different. But across all of them, there is a consistent psychological thread that researchers who study attacks on law enforcement facilities have identified and documented. The police station is never just a building, and attacking it is never just an act of violence. It is an act of communication, what the attacker is saying. When Benny Lee Lawson left handwritten notes at his home listing the people he intended to target and then walked into police headquarters, he was not acting irrationally, not in the narrow sense of having no comprehensible internal logic. He had been questioned as a murder suspect. He believed the case was being built against him. He made a calculation, removed the people building it. The calculation was catastrophically wrong and catastrophically violent, but it followed a coherent internal logic rooted in desperation and the specific distorted thinking that leads people to believe that offensive action is their only remaining option. When the communist forces besieged Bukit Kepong, the tactical goal was weapons seizure and prestige reinforcement. But the symbolic goal, articulated in the attacker's own statement, was clear. We wanted to strengthen our prestige in that area. To attack the police station was to demonstrate that the colonial authority it represented could be reached, could be challenged, could be humiliated. The building was a symbol of an order they were trying to overturn. When Raiden Lukman entered the Ulu Tiram station with a machete and an IS flag draped over his shoulder, he was enacting a ritual that has been documented in dozens of Islamic State-inspired attacks across the world. What analysts call a performative attack. The choice of a police station over a random civilian target was not incidental. It was the point. The police station was a representative of the state authority that his ideology demanded he confront. And this is what makes attacks on police stations psychologically distinct from most other forms of violent crime. They are, at some level, almost always statements. Someone attacking a police station has decided that the institution itself, not just the individuals inside, but what the building represents, must be struck, understanding that logic is not the same as excusing it. But it is the only way to understand what drives someone to walk through a door that nearly everyone else on Earth would never consider opening in that way. What the research shows, and what it suggests. Studies of attacks on law enforcement facilities consistently identify several psychological profiles. There is a grievance-driven attacker, like Lawson, whose relationship with the institution is personal and specific, rooted in a particular conflict or perceived injustice. There is the ideologically motivated attacker, whose relationship with the institution is abstract and systemic, where the building represents a regime, a colonial power, an occupying force, an oppressive state. And there is a radicalized attacker, who has moved through a process of identity reconstruction in which violence against state symbols has been presented, usually within a closed community or relationship, as not just permissible but obligatory. What is common across all 3 profiles is a process of dehumanization of the people inside the building, yes, but more fundamentally of the institution itself. The building, in the attacker's mind, stops being a place where human beings work and becomes a symbol to be struck. The officers inside stopped being people with families and 22-year-old constables on their first job and 60-year-old veterans who could have retired years ago but didn't. They become stand-ins for everything the attacker has decided must be destroyed. This is why the aftermath of these attacks is so important. Not just the security protocol changes, not just the barrier installations and the gate closing times and the CCTV upgrades, but the memorial services, the name-reading ceremonies, the annual wreath layings, the posthumous promotions. These are not ceremonial sentiment. They are the institutional refusal to allow the dehumanization to be the last word. They are the insistence that the people who died inside those buildings were not symbols. They were people, and their names will be said out loud every year, for as long as the institution endures. Times. Closing. What these buildings actually are. We began this episode with a question about what happens when the fortress becomes a target. 3 case studies later, here's what the evidence actually shows. The fortress does not stop being the fortress because it is attacked. The Bukit Kepong officers fought for 4 hours with 20 men against 200 because they decided the ground they stood on was worth standing on. Martha Dixon Martinez heard a fully automatic weapon firing in the room next door and drew her sidearm and went toward it because the people in that room were her colleagues and she was not going to leave them. The officers at Ulu Tiram who ran toward an armed attacker already holding a weapon he had taken from a fallen colleague made the same decision. Not after extended deliberation, not after a cost-benefit analysis, but in the fraction of a second that these moments allow. The building is not the fortress. The people inside it are. And what these cases force into the open, uncomfortably, honestly, without easy resolution, is a question of what it means to be the kind of person who chooses that building, who pins on a badge and shows up, including on the mornings when the threat is not abstract but immediate and armed and already through the door. There is something in that choice that deserves more than a news cycle. It deserves a careful examination of what it actually means, what it costs, and what it is protecting, because the alternative to the fortress, the world without it, is not something most of us want to live in. Times. Which of these 3 incidents did you find most difficult to process? The ones where the attack was ideological, or the ones where it was personal? Drop a comment and tell me. I want to know what lands differently depending on where you're watching from. And share this one if you think someone in your circle needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one.